The crimson sun hung low over the endless prairie, casting long shadows across the wheat fields that stretched like a golden ocean toward the horizon. Thomas Whitmore pulled his worn hat down against the evening light as he guided his weathered horse along the fence line, checking for breaks that the harsh winter storms might have left behind. At 62, his calloused hands knew every inch of this rugged land, every post and wire that marked the boundary of his modest ranch on the outskirts of Clearwater Valley. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming rain and something else that made him pause, the faint smell of wood smoke from a dying fire. Thomas frowned, pulling his horse to a stop with practiced ease. There shouldn't be any fires out here, not on his property. His closest neighbor was miles away across the rolling hills, and the town was even farther beyond the distant ridge. He squinted across the field, his experienced eyes searching the gathering dusk for the source of that telltale smoke. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against the weathered fence post, so still and quiet that he almost missed her entirely among the shadows. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a tattered brown dress that had clearly seen better days and harder times. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her thin shoulders shook with more than just the evening chill that swept across the open prairie. Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass that rustled in the wind. The child looked up at his approach, her eyes wide with fear and something deeper, a hollowness that no child should ever carry. A darkness that spoke of hunger and loss in nights spent sleeping under the unforgiving stars. She pressed herself closer to the fence post, as if she could disappear into the weathered wood itself, her small frame trembling like a wounded bird. "Easy there, little one," Thomas said softly, removing his hat and crouching down to her level, his voice gentle as morning rain. "I'm not going to hurt you, I'm Thomas. This is my land you're sitting on, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The girl said nothing, but her eyes never left his face. Up close, he could see the dirt streaked across her hollow cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her painfully small frame. His heart clenched with recognition. He'd seen that look before, during the harsh winter of '87 when families had lost everything and children had wandered into town more ghost than human, more memory than flesh. "Did you eat today?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The girl's lower lip trembled, and slowly, painfully, she shook her head. Thomas felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been locked away for too many years since Martha's passing. "Well, that won't do at all," he said, standing and extending his weathered hand. "How about we get you something warm to eat? I've got beef stew simmering back at the house, and biscuits that are probably burning as we speak." The girl stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Thomas waited patiently, letting her decide. Trust was earned, not demanded, especially from someone so young who had clearly learned to be afraid of the world and everyone in it. Finally, like a flower turning toward sunlight, she placed her small, cold hand in his. The ride back to the house was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the whispered sound of wind through the grass. The girl sat in front of him on the saddle, still trembling but no longer from the cold alone. Thomas could feel the rapid beating of her heart through her thin dress, could sense the mixture of hope and fear that coursed through her small body. His house was nothing grand by any measure, a simple 2-story structure built with his own hands after he'd claimed this land 15 years ago. But it was solid and warm, with smoke curling from the stone chimney and yellow light spilling from the windows like liquid gold. To a child who had been sleeping under the vast canopy of stars, it must have looked like a palace rising from the prairie. Inside, Thomas lit more oil lamps and stirred the bubbling stew while the girl stood uncertainly by the door, poised as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The kitchen was sparse but clean, with a well-worn wooden table and chairs that had hosted many solitary meals over the years since Martha's death. "You can sit anywhere you like," Thomas said, ladling the aromatic stew into 2 bowls. "What's your name, child?" "Lucy," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it over the crackling of the fire. "Lucy. That's a beautiful name. My wife's sister was named Lucy." He set the bowl in front of her and watched as she stared at it as if it might vanish like a mirage. "Go ahead. It's yours." The first spoonful was tentative, but once she started eating, she couldn't stop. Thomas pretended not to notice the way she wolfed down the food, or how she held the bowl close to her chest as if protecting it from invisible thieves. Instead, he busied himself cutting thick slices of fresh bread and spreading them with creamy butter and golden honey. "Where's your family, Lucy?" he asked carefully, his voice soft as evening rain. Her spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Dead," she said simply, the word falling like a stone into still water. "Mama died of the fever 3 weeks ago. Papa died before that, in the mine accident." Thomas's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm sorry to hear that. Have you been alone all this time?" Lucy nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Mrs. Henderson said she'd take me in, but her husband said they already had too many mouths to feed. Said I should go to the orphanage in Denver, but I don't want to go there. I heard terrible things about that place." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd heard things about the Denver orphanage, too. Overcrowded, underfunded, more concerned with cheap labor than child welfare. No place for a spirited little girl who deserved better than just surviving from one day to the next. "Well," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "you don't have to worry about that tonight. You can sleep here, get your strength back." As if summoned by the mention of sleep, exhaustion seemed to crash over Lucy all at once. Her eyelids drooped, and she swayed in her chair like a flower bending in the wind. Thomas scooped her up gently, surprised by how light she was, and carried her upstairs to the small room that had once been meant for guests who never came. The bed was too big for such a small person, but Lucy curled up in the center like a kitten seeking warmth, still wearing her tattered dress. Thomas found an old quilt his wife Martha had made years ago, before the consumption took her, and tucked it around Lucy's sleeping form. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember what this room might have been like if things had been different, if Martha had lived, if they'd been blessed with children of their own. But that was a dangerous path to walk down, and Thomas had learned long ago that dwelling on what ifs only led to heartache and regret. He blew out the lamp and quietly closed the door, leaving it slightly ajar in case Lucy woke frightened in the night. The next morning, Thomas woke to the acrid smell of something burning. He rushed downstairs to find Lucy standing on a wooden chair at the stove, trying to flip flapjacks that were decidedly more char than cake. She looked up at him with a mixture of pride and anxiety dancing in her young eyes. "I wanted to make breakfast," she said, her voice small but determined. "To thank you for the food and the bed, but I think I'm doing something wrong." Thomas couldn't help but smile, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "Well, the thought is what counts. But maybe we should start with something a little easier." He moved the smoking pan off the heat and helped her down from the chair. "How about eggs? They're harder to burn." Together they made a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, Lucy watching intently as Thomas showed her how to crack the shells without getting bits in the pan. She absorbed every instruction like a sponge absorbing water, eager to learn, eager to be useful and prove her worth. "My mama taught me to cook a little," she said as they sat down to eat, her voice carrying the weight of fresh grief. "But Papa always said I was too young for the stove, said I'd burn the house down." Her voice caught slightly on the memory. "Well, your papa was just being careful," Thomas said gently, "but there's no reason you can't learn if you want to." They spent the morning doing chores together around the ranch. Lucy insisted on helping, following Thomas around like a small shadow, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. She scattered feed for the chickens with careful precision, helped him mend a section of fence, and listened with rapt attention as he explained the daily rhythms of ranch life. Her questions came in a steady stream. Why did the chickens lay eggs? How did you know when a fence needed fixing? What made the grass grow so green in some places and brown in others? Thomas found himself enjoying her curiosity, the way she looked at everything with wonder despite the hardships she'd endured. It had been so long since he'd shared this land with anyone, so long since another person had found joy in the simple miracle of a well-tended ranch and the honest work it required. But as the day wore on and the sun climbed higher in the endless sky, reality began to intrude like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What was he going to do with Lucy? He couldn't keep her indefinitely. A 62-year-old bachelor rancher was hardly suitable to raise a young girl. The decent thing, the responsible thing, would be to take her to town, find a proper family willing to adopt her. There had to be someone in Clearwater Valley who would take in an orphaned child. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Thomas broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind all day. "Lucy, I've been thinking. Tomorrow, maybe we should ride into town. See if we can find you a nice family to stay with, a real family, with a mother and father who can give you what you need." Lucy was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if she'd fallen asleep in her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but small as a whisper. "You don't want me to stay." The question pierced him like an arrow finding its mark. "It's not about what I want, child. It's about what's best for you. You need to be with people who know how to raise children, who can send you to school, teach you to be a proper young lady. I like it here," Lucy said quietly, her voice carrying across the porch like music. "I like learning about the ranch. I like helping with the chickens. I like the way the house smells like bread and coffee in the morning." She paused, then added in an even smaller voice, "I like you, Mr. Thomas." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility and longing settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I like you too, Lucy. More than I expected to. But that doesn't change the facts. You deserve a chance at a real childhood, with toys and friends your own age and a mother who can braid your hair properly." "I don't need toys," Lucy said fiercely, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "I need a home. I need someone who won't send me away when things get hard." She turned to look at him, her young face serious beyond her years. "You asked if I ate yesterday. Nobody else asked me that. Nobody else cared enough to wonder." The words hung between them in the cool night air, carrying more truth than Thomas was comfortable facing. He'd spent 15 long years convincing himself that solitude was enough, that his land and his cattle and his quiet routines were all he needed to fill the empty spaces in his life. But watching Lucy discover the simple joys of ranch life, seeing her face light up when she successfully gathered eggs or helped repair a fence post, it awakened something in him that he'd thought long buried with Martha. The next morning brought unexpected visitors that would change everything. Thomas was repairing the barn door when he heard the sound of horses approaching across the prairie. 2 riders crested the hill, Sheriff Bill Morrison and a stern-looking woman Thomas didn't recognize, dressed in severe black clothing with her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Morning, Thomas," Sheriff Morrison called out, dismounting near the porch with obvious reluctance. "This here is Mrs. Abernathy from the Children's Aid Society. We heard you might have found something that belongs to them." Lucy, who had been feeding the chickens near the barn, froze at the sound of strange voices. She looked toward Thomas with barely concealed panic, the bucket of feed slipping from her hands to scatter across the ground. Mrs. Abernathy surveyed the scene with cool efficiency that made Thomas's skin crawl. "There she is, Lucy Patterson, I presume. You've led us quite a chase, young lady. Running away from Mrs. Henderson's house, disappearing into the countryside. Very irresponsible behavior for a child of your station." "She didn't run away," Thomas said firmly, moving to stand between Lucy and the visitors. "She was alone, hungry, sleeping rough out in the open. She came to me for help and I gave it to her." "Yes, well, that's neither here nor there," Mrs. Abernathy replied crisply, waving her hand dismissively. "The child is a ward of the state now. We've made arrangements for her placement in the Denver Children's Home. She'll receive proper care and education there, learn useful skills for her future employment." Lucy had crept closer to Thomas, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. He could feel her trembling, could sense her desperation without looking down at her. The child who had begun to bloom in just 2 short days was wilting before his eyes. "And if she doesn't want to go?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a warning edge. Mrs. Abernathy's expression grew stern and condescending. "What she wants is irrelevant, Mr. Whitmore. She's a child, and children don't always know what's best for them. That's why we have institutions, to provide structure and guidance for wayward youth like this one." "She's not wayward," Thomas said, his voice hardening like steel cooling in winter air. "She's grieving. She's lost everything that mattered to her, and now you want to ship her off to strangers in a place she's never seen." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He'd known Thomas for years, knew him to be a good man despite his reclusive tendencies after Martha's death. "Thomas, I understand your feelings on this matter, but the law is the law. Orphan children need to be placed in proper care facilities where they can receive adequate supervision." "What if she wasn't orphaned?" Thomas asked quietly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him he didn't even know existed. The question caught everyone by surprise. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sheriff Morrison stared at Thomas, as if he'd announced his intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Abernathy finally sputtered. Thomas felt Lucy's grip on his hand tighten to almost painful intensity. He looked down at her upturned face, saw the hope and fear warring in her dark eyes like storm clouds battling for dominance of the sky, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "What if I adopted her?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Mrs. Abernathy's mouth opened and closed several more times before she managed to form words. "Adopt her." She finally managed to croak. "Mr. Whitmore, you're an unmarried man, living alone on an isolated ranch miles from civilization. You have no experience with children, no female influence in the household, no understanding of what it takes to raise a proper young lady. It would be highly irregular, completely unprecedented." "Irregular, maybe, but not illegal," Thomas replied steadily. "I own my land free and clear. I have steady income from my cattle and grain crops, and I can provide for all her needs. What else does the law require?" "Love," Lucy whispered, so quietly that only Thomas heard her, but the word seemed to echo in his heart like a bell tolling across the prairie. Mrs. Abernathy was already shaking her head vigorously. "The Denver facility has excellent programs, Mr. Whitmore. She'll learn useful skills, domestic arts, proper deportment, basic literacy and arithmetic. She'll be prepared for a productive life in service or as a wife to a working man. She'll have structure, discipline, moral guidance from trained professionals." "She'll learn to survive, you mean?" Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But what about learning to live? What about learning to love the land, to understand the natural world, to find joy in honest work and simple pleasures? What about learning that she has value beyond what she can do for others?" He knelt down beside Lucy, bringing himself to her eye level, his weathered hands gentle on her thin shoulders. "What do you say, little one? Would you like to stay here with me? It won't be easy. Ranch life is hard work, and I'm not sure I know the first thing about raising a daughter. But I promise you this, you'll never go hungry again, you'll never sleep in the cold, and you'll never have to wonder if someone cares whether you ate today." Lucy's answer came not in words, but in the way she threw her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were the last solid thing in a world that had proven treacherous and uncertain. Thomas held her back, feeling 15 years of loneliness and grief crack open like a dam giving way to spring floodwater. Mrs. Abernathy made several more protests, citing regulations and procedures and the complete impropriety of the entire situation. She spoke of home visits and character references and the lengthy legal process involved in adoption. But Sheriff Morrison, perhaps moved by the sight of the gruff rancher and the small girl clinging to each other as if their lives depended on it, finally interceded. "Mrs. Abernathy, if Mr. Whitmore wants to file for legal adoption, that's his right as a citizen. The child appears to be in good health and spirits. Perhaps we should let the courts decide what's in her best interest rather than making assumptions." The legal proceedings that followed took 3 long months, during which Lucy lived in a constant state of anxious hope, afraid that each day might be the one when someone came to take her away from the only place that had felt like home since her parents died. But Thomas worked tirelessly with a lawyer from the county seat, filing papers, undergoing interviews, and submitting to inspections of his home and finances by stern, faced officials who seemed determined to find fault with his unconventional household. The judge who finally heard their case was a weathered man named Samuel Crawford, who had raised 5 children of his own after his wife died in childbirth. He questioned Lucy privately about her wishes, observed the obvious bond between her and Thomas during several court sessions, and ultimately ruled that adoption was indeed in the child's best interest. "Mr. Whitmore," he said solemnly from his bench, his kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed spectacles, "you are taking on a tremendous responsibility. This child has suffered significant loss and trauma in her young life. She will need patience, understanding, and unwavering commitment. She will test your resolve, challenge your assumptions, and demand sacrifices you cannot yet imagine. Are you truly prepared for that?" Thomas looked at Lucy, sitting beside him in her best dress. The first new clothing he'd bought her, blue as a summer sky and embroidered with tiny white flowers. She had gained weight over the past months, her hollow cheeks had filled out, and her hair now gleamed with health and careful brushing. But more than her physical transformation, It was the light in her eyes that convinced him he was doing the right thing. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The years that followed were filled with challenges neither of them had anticipated. Lucy struggled with nightmares that left her screaming in the dark, sudden fears that would grip her without warning, and moments of inconsolable grief for the parents she'd lost. Thomas struggled with the overwhelming responsibility of shaping a young life, making decisions about everything from schooling to discipline, to how to explain the complex realities of growing up to a girl who was maturing too fast in some ways and not fast enough in others. But there were triumphs too, small victories that made all the difficulties worthwhile. Lucy proved to be a natural with the animals, gentle with the horses and intuitive about their needs in ways that amazed Thomas. She learned to ride like she was born to it, her small form moving in perfect harmony with her mare as they raced across the endless prairie. She excelled in the correspondence courses Thomas arranged for her education, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences that surprised even her tutors. Most importantly, she learned to trust again. Not just Thomas, but the world itself. She made friends with the children in town during their weekly trips for supplies and church services. She helped organize social gatherings and school programs, her natural leadership abilities emerging as she grew more confident. She grew from a frightened, hollow-eyed child into a vibrant young woman with strong opinions, an infectious laugh, and a deep love for the land that had become her salvation. Thomas, meanwhile, discovered joys he'd never expected to experience. Teaching Lucy to rope cattle and watching her face light up when she successfully completed a difficult lasso. Listening to her chatter about everything from the migration patterns of barn swallows to her dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday. Seeing her eyes widen with wonder when he showed her the constellations on clear winter nights. These moments filled spaces in his heart he hadn't even realized were empty since Martha's death. On Lucy's 18th birthday, they rode out to the spot where he'd first found her, now marked by a small grove of cottonwood trees they'd planted together over the years. The original fence post was still there, weathered but sturdy, a silent witness to the night that had changed both their lives forever. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come along that evening? Thomas asked as they sat in the dappled shade, sharing a picnic lunch that Lucy had prepared with her own skilled hands. Lucy considered the question seriously, as she considered most things these days. At 18, she was thoughtful and mature beyond her years, but there was still something of that curious child in her bright eyes that age could never diminish. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, her voice steady and sure, but not in a sad way, more like grateful beyond words. Grateful that you did come along when you did. Grateful that you asked if I'd eaten that day. Grateful that you saw me as worth saving when I couldn't even see it myself. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion, as it always did, when he thought about how close he'd come to losing this remarkable young woman. "You saved me too, you know. I just didn't realize I needed saving until you showed up and turned my whole world upside down." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the distance and listening to the wind whisper its eternal secrets through the grass. Finally, Lucy spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of carefully considered plans. "I've been thinking about something important, Paye." The word still caught him off guard sometimes, filled him with a pride and tenderness he never quite knew how to express adequately. "What's that, sweetheart?" "I want to be a teacher, like we've talked about for years. But I want to teach here in Clearwater Valley. I want to stay close to home, close to you." She paused, then added with a smile that lit up her entire face, "I want to make sure no other children slip through the cracks the way I almost did. I want to be the person who asks if they've eaten today." Thomas nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He thought about that frightened little girl huddled by the fence post 10 years ago, and the confident young woman sitting beside him now. The transformation seemed impossible, miraculous even, like watching winter turn to spring in the space of a heartbeat. But then he supposed that was what love did. It transformed the broken into the whole, the lost into the found, the afraid into the brave, the unwanted into the cherished. As the sun began to set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the land that had become their sanctuary and their salvation, Thomas reflected on the strange and wonderful turns life could take. He'd spent so many years convinced that his purpose was simple and solitary: tend his cattle, work his land, live quietly and alone until his time came to join Martha in whatever lay beyond this life. He'd never imagined that his true purpose might walk up to him, in the form of a hungry child on a cold autumn evening, that salvation might come disguised as responsibility, that the greatest joy and meaning of his life might spring from another soul's deepest sorrow. Lucy stood and brushed the dust from her skirt, then offered him her hand. "Come on. Pie, let's go home. I'll make that pot roast you love so much, and you can tell me again about the time you and Sheriff Morrison tried to break that wild bronco that threw you both in the creek." Thomas laughed, the sound carrying across the darkening prairie like a prayer of thanksgiving. "You've heard that story 100 times if you've heard it once. And I'll hear it 100 more?" Lucy replied with a grin, because that's what families do. They tell the same stories over and over until they become part of who we are, until they become the foundation we build our lives on. As they rode home together in the gathering dusk, Thomas marveled at the wisdom of this remarkable young woman he'd been privileged to raise and learn from. She was absolutely right. Families did tell stories, weaving the threads of their shared experiences into something larger and more meaningful than themselves. And their story, he knew with certainty, was far from over. It would continue in the children Lucy would teach, the lives she would touch, the kindness she would pass forward to others, because kindness had once been shown to her when she needed it most desperately. The lights of their house appeared in the distance, warm and welcoming against the vast darkness of the prairie night. Home. It was such a simple word. But Thomas had learned through hard, one experience, that its true meaning could only be measured by the love it contained, the memories it sheltered, and the hope it nurtured. And theirs, he knew beyond any doubt, contained enough of all three to last them both a lifetime and beyond.